The Buick Roadmaster Sedanet is one of those cars that seems perfectly normal until your eye follows the roofline all the way to the back and realizes something is different. Not dramatically different at first, just subtly, persistently unusual. And the longer you look, the stranger it becomes. Built by Buick during a moment when American design was beginning to flirt with aerodynamics in a more serious way, the Sedanet version of the Roadmaster wasn't just a styling variation. It was an attempt to reinterpret what a luxury car could look like when influenced by motion, airflow, and the growing fascination with aircraft design. That's where the defining feature comes in, the fastback. Instead of a traditional upright rear section with a defined trunk, the Buick Roadmaster Sedanet carries its roofline in one continuous arc from the windshield all the way to the tail. There is no visual break, no step down, no separation between cabin and trunk. It's one uninterrupted curve. From a distance, it looks elegant, almost effortless. The shape suggests speed even when the car is standing still. It feels smoother, more refined, more modern than many of its contemporaries. But up close, the design begins to reveal its contradictions, because that smooth curve comes at a cost. The trunk space becomes compromised. Without a traditional rear deck, storage is limited and awkwardly shaped. What would normally be a practical, accessible area turns into something more constrained, more form than function. And then there's visibility. That long, sloping rear doesn't just affect storage, it affects what the driver can see. The rear window is smaller and positioned at an angle that reduces clarity. Combined with the length of the car, it creates a driving experience where awareness of what's behind you is limited. One owner joked in a way that feels both humorous and accurate, "You drive it forward and hope nothing important is behind you." That line captures the central tension. Because the Sedanet isn't impractical by accident, it's impractical by priority. The goal wasn't maximum usability, it was visual flow. The designers were chasing a new kind of aesthetic, one influenced by aircraft fuselages, streamlining, and the idea that a car should move through air as cleanly as possible. And in that pursuit, traditional proportions were sacrificed. The car stops looking like a collection of parts and starts looking like a single volume, almost like a teardrop stretched into a luxury coupe. The rear fenders blend into the body. The roofline becomes the defining feature. The entire shape feels like it was drawn in one continuous motion. That's what gives it its strange, almost surreal presence, because it doesn't look assembled, it looks smoothed. One design observer later described it like this: "It looks like someone took a standard car and erased all the edges." That erasure is what makes it feel slightly disorienting. We're used to cars having clear sections: hood, cabin, trunk. The Sedanet blurs those boundaries. It removes the visual cues that help us understand structure and replaces them with flow. And flow, while beautiful, can also feel unfamiliar, especially in a car meant for everyday use. That's where the insane quality begins to emerge. Because the Buick Roadmaster Sedanet takes an idea that belongs to concept cars or experimental design, aircraft-inspired aerodynamics, and applies it directly to a production luxury vehicle. No compromise, no moderation, just a full commitment to the idea. And that commitment creates a kind of mismatch. A practical luxury car shaped like a wind tunnel experiment. A comfortable cruiser with reduced visibility and unconventional proportions. A familiar machine made slightly unfamiliar by one continuous curve. One historian later summed it up in a way that captures its place in design history. It's what happens when aerodynamics stop being a feature and become the entire philosophy. What makes it insane, aircraft-inspired fastback design pushed into everyday luxury. But the deeper reality is that the Buick Roadmaster Sedanet represents a moment when designers began to ask a new question. What if a car didn't have to look like a machine built in sections? What if it could look like something shaped by motion itself? The answer, in this case, is something both elegant and slightly impractical. A car that flows beautifully forward and leaves everything behind it just a little harder to see. The Lincoln Continental Cabriolet is one of those cars that defines elegance so convincingly that you almost don't notice how unusual it actually is until you step back and really look at its proportions. And then it starts to feel stretched. Built by Lincoln Motor Company under Ford Motor Company, the Continental was designed to be refined, restrained, and timeless. It avoided the excess chrome and flamboyance of many American cars of its era, instead focusing on clean lines and balanced surfaces. But that balance hides something more extreme, because the proportions are anything but normal. The hood is long, exceptionally long, extending forward in a way that feels almost exaggerated even by pre-war luxury standards. It doesn't just house the engine, it dominates the front half of the car, creating a sense of length that immediately sets the tone. Then, your eye moves to the rear and finds the spare tire. Mounted externally, integrated into the rear design, it adds visual weight and extension to the back of the car. Instead of ending cleanly, the body stretches outward again, as if the design refused to stop at a conventional boundary. So, what you get is something unusual, a car extended at both ends. The cabin, by comparison, feels almost compressed between these two long forms. It's not small, but visually it becomes the middle of a much larger composition. One observer once described it perfectly. It looks like someone pulled the car from both sides until it settled into shape. That's the surreal quality. Because while each individual element is elegant, the long hood, the smooth sides, the rear-mounted spare, the combination creates proportions that feel slightly unreal. The car looks longer than it should be, lower than expected, and more drawn out than typical designs of the time. And yet, it works. That's what makes it so fascinating. Because the Lincoln Continental Cabriolet disguises its extremeness with restraint. There are no aggressive lines, no dramatic fins, no excessive ornamentation. The surfaces are smooth, the details are subtle, and the overall presentation is calm. It doesn't announce its strangeness, it hides it behind elegance. But that elegance comes with real-world consequences. Parking a car like this is not simple. The long hood makes it difficult to judge distance from the front, especially in tight spaces. The extended rear with the spare tire adds length that isn't immediately intuitive when maneuvering. You're always dealing with more car than you think. Tight turns require planning, narrow streets become challenging. Visibility, especially in a convertible with its low seating position, doesn't always help. It's a car that demands awareness, not just of where you are, but of how far the car extends beyond you. One owner once remarked, "It's not hard to drive, but it's easy to misjudge." That distinction matters. Because the car isn't difficult in terms of mechanics, it's difficult in terms of perception. It asks the driver to adapt to its proportions, to understand its length in a way that more conventional cars don't require. And that's where the insane aspect reveals itself. Because the design prioritizes visual harmony over spatial practicality. The long hood isn't necessary, it's expressive. The rear-mounted spare isn't efficient, it's stylistic. The stretched silhouette isn't practical, it's intentional. Everything about the car is designed to create a certain presence, even if that presence complicates everyday use. And that presence is undeniable. Low, long, and flowing, the Continental Cabriolet looks like it's gliding even when it's parked. It has a kind of quiet authority, a confidence that comes not from aggression, but from proportion and restraint. One automotive historian later summarized its impact like this: "It doesn't look extreme, but it is. It just hides it better than anything else." What makes it insane is extreme proportions disguised as elegance. But the deeper truth is that the Lincoln Continental Cabriolet represents a moment when design was willing to push boundaries, not through excess, but through subtle exaggeration. Stretch the hood just a little further, extend the rear just a little more, refine the lines until the extremes feel natural. And the result is a car that feels perfectly composed until you realize how far it's been pushed beyond normal. The Cadillac Series 62 Torpedo is one of those designs that feels obvious today, but only because it changed what normal looks like. In its own time, it didn't look natural. It looked unfamiliar, slightly inflated, and strangely unified in a way people weren't used to seeing. Built by Cadillac under General Motors, the Torpedo styling wasn't just a trim level or a marketing name, it was a shift in design philosophy. Up until that point, most cars still clearly showed their structure. Fenders stood apart from the body, running boards visually separated sections. Each part of the car looked like it had been assembled piece by piece. The Torpedo erased that idea. Instead of separate elements, the Cadillac Series 62 Torpedo presents itself as a single continuous form. The fenders are integrated into the body, the sides are widened and smoothed, the transitions between panels are softened until the entire car feels like one unified volume rather than a collection of parts. That's what makes it feel so different, because visually it removes the edges people were used to. Where older cars had clear boundaries, this has flow. Where older cars had structure, this has mass. And that mass is what confused people. To some, it looked futuristic, like something shaped by wind rather than by assembly lines. The car appeared lower, wider, and more planted. It had presence in a way earlier designs didn't. It suggested modernity even before most people knew what modern automotive design would look like. But to others, it felt wrong, because the human eye wasn't used to this kind of integration yet. Without separate fenders and visible structure, the car could appear swollen, almost overfilled, as if the body had expanded beyond its natural shape. One observer at the time described it in a way that captures that discomfort. It looks like the car forgot where one part ends and the next begins. That's the key. The Torpedo design removes those endings. Everything blends, everything connects, everything flows into the next surface without interruption. And while that's exactly what makes modern cars look right today, in the early 1940s it created a kind of visual uncertainty. People couldn't immediately understand what they were looking at, and when something familiar becomes hard to interpret, it starts to feel alien. Even the proportions contribute to that effect. The widened body and integrated fenders give the car a broader stance, making it appear heavier and more substantial. Combined with the smooth surfaces, it creates a shape that feels less mechanical and more sculptural. Less assembled, more formed. That shift from machine to object is subtle but important, because the Cadillac Series 62 Torpedo doesn't just change how the car looks, it changes how it's perceived. Instead of seeing individual components working together, you see a single entity, and that's what makes it feel ahead of its time. But that forward-thinking design also came with trade-offs. The integrated body made repairs complex compared to earlier cars with bolt-on fenders. Damage to one area could affect the entire panel. What used to be a simple replacement became a more involved process. And visually, the lack of definition could make the car harder to read in tight spaces. The edges weren't as clear, the boundaries less obvious. You had to rely more on intuition when maneuvering because the shape didn't give you the same visual cues as older designs. It's not that it was difficult, it's just unfamiliar. One owner reflected on that experience. It felt bigger than it was because you couldn't see where it ended. That sense of uncertainty is part of what made the design feel so radical at the time, because the Torpedo wasn't just evolving existing ideas, it was replacing them. It marked the beginning of a transition, from separate to integrated, from mechanical to sculptural, from visible structure to hidden form. And once that shift happened, there was no going back. One automotive historian later summarized its importance like this: "It didn't just introduce a new style, it made the old one obsolete." What makes it insane is early integrated body design that looked alien for its time. But the deeper reality is even more significant. The Cadillac Series 62 Torpedo feels strange only because it arrived before people were ready for it. Today, its ideas are everywhere. Smooth sides, integrated panels, unified shapes. What once looked swollen now looks standard. What once felt alien now feels correct. And that's the mark of a truly radical design. Not that it looks strange forever, but that it changes the definition of what normal becomes.
The Frazer Manhattan is one of the clearest examples of what happens when an entire industry is trying to reinvent itself and hasn't yet agreed on what the future is supposed to look like. It doesn't fail in an obvious way. It doesn't shock or offend. Instead, it creates a subtler reaction: hesitation. You look at it and something doesn't fully settle. Built by Kaiser Frazer in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Manhattan arrived at a moment of enormous pressure. The American auto industry had been frozen for years, focused entirely on wartime production. When civilian cars returned, there was demand, massive demand, but also uncertainty. Designers knew the pre-war look was outdated, but they didn't yet know what would replace it. And the Frazer Manhattan lives right in that gap. At a distance, it seems modern. The body is smoother than pre-war cars, the fenders are no longer completely separate, and there's a clear attempt to move toward integration. The lines are simplified, the surfaces less cluttered. But the closer you look, the more contradictions appear. The height is the first thing that feels unusual. The Manhattan stands tall, taller than what would soon become standard. Later post-war cars would go lower, wider, more horizontal. But here, the vertical dimension still dominates. It gives the car a kind of upright presence that feels formal, but also slightly outdated. Then there's the width, or rather the lack of it. Compared to its height, the stance is relatively narrow. This creates a proportion that feels subtly unstable, not physically, but visually. The car doesn't sit low and planted, it sits tall and contained, as if the body has been stretched upward rather than outward. And that imbalance is hard to ignore once you notice it. One observer described it in a way that captures this perfectly. It looks like it grew before it spread out. That's exactly what happened. The design moved forward in some areas, but not in others. The body surfaces are another source of that tension. They're rounded, but not fluid, smoothed, but not fully resolved. You can see the intention to create a modern aerodynamic shape, but the execution feels cautious, as if the designers stopped just short of committing completely. The curves don't flow with confidence, they hesitate. And that hesitation is what makes the car feel so unusual. Because great design, whether classic or modern, usually feels decisive. It tells you what it is immediately. The Manhattan does something different. It asks a question instead of giving an answer. From one angle, it looks progressive. From another, it feels conservative. From a third, it seems like a blend that never quite integrates. And that creates a kind of visual ambiguity that's rare in automotive design. Even the front and rear of the car seem to belong to slightly different philosophies. The front suggests movement toward modernity, simplified, cleaner, less ornamented. The rear, however, still carries some of the upright, formal characteristics of earlier designs. It's not a clash, it's a compromise, and compromises rarely feel entirely comfortable. One period reviewer captured this sense of unease with a line that has followed the car ever since. It's modern, but not quite sure how. That uncertainty becomes more apparent the longer you spend with the car. Because it doesn't resolve itself over time, it stays in that in-between state. Driving it reinforces that feeling. The car behaves like something from the older era, tall seating position, a sense of vertical presence, while visually suggesting something newer. There's a disconnect between what you see and what you feel, and that disconnect adds to the strangeness. One longtime owner reflected on it years later. You get used to it, but you never quite stop noticing it. That's an unusual statement for a car. Most vehicles either blend into the background or stand out clearly. The Frazer Manhattan does neither. It remains subtly noticeable, not because it demands attention, but because it never fully aligns with expectation. Culturally, that placed it in a difficult position. It wasn't traditional enough to feel comfortably familiar. It wasn't modern enough to feel exciting or forward-looking. It occupied a middle ground that's hard to market and even harder to define. And yet, that's exactly what makes it fascinating today. Because it shows the process of change, not the result. It captures a moment when designers were experimenting, adjusting, testing boundaries, but hadn't yet arrived at a clear conclusion. It's not the future, it's the search for the future. One automotive historian later described it in a way that feels almost philosophical. It's not a design, it's a transition made visible. What makes it insane? Transitional design that doesn't fully belong to any era. But the deeper reality goes even further. The Frazer Manhattan feels strange because it reflects uncertainty, something most designs try to hide. It doesn't present a finished idea, it presents a work in progress. A car that is neither fully pre-war nor fully post-war. A shape that hasn't decided whether to stand tall or stretch wide. A design language that hasn't yet found its voice. And that's why it leaves such a lasting impression. Not because it's extreme, not because it's beautiful or ugly, but because it feels unresolved. A machine caught mid-evolution. A car that doesn't belong to a single moment, but instead captures exact the point where one era ended and another hadn't quite begun.
The Kaiser Special is one of the purest examples of a car that isn't just a product, it's a question. A question about what the future should look like, asked at a time when no one had a clear answer yet. Built by Kaiser Frazer, the Special arrived right at the moment when the American auto industry restarted after World War II. Most manufacturers played it safe at first, reworking pre-war designs because they had to move quickly. But Kaiser did something different. They started fresh. And that's why the Kaiser Special feels so unusual, because it isn't evolving the past, it's trying to invent the future. At first glance, the car looks clean and modern. The belt line is low, which creates a more open, airy feeling compared to older cars. The cabin is wide, giving it a sense of space that feels advanced for its time. The body is smoothed out with fewer separate elements and less visual clutter. It's clearly moving forward. But then the proportions begin to create tension, because while the built line is low, the overall body is still tall. That combination produces something strange, a car that feels simultaneously stretched downward and upward. The windows are large and open, but the body beneath them has significant height. The roof doesn't quite sit low enough to match the modern direction, and the width, while improved, doesn't fully compensate. So visually, the car feels both flattened and elevated at the same time. One observer later described it in a way that captures that contradiction perfectly. It looks like it's trying to sit lower than it actually does. That's the essence of the design. It suggests modern proportions, but doesn't fully achieve them. And that creates a kind of visual imbalance that's hard to ignore once you notice it. The surfaces add another layer to that feeling. They're smooth, simplified, and clearly moving away from pre-war ornamentation, but they also lack the confidence that would define later 1950s designs. The curves are there, but they're restrained. The lines are clean, but not yet bold. It feels like the designers were testing ideas rather than declaring them, and that's exactly what was happening. Because the Kaiser Special isn't a finalized vision of the future, it's an early draft. You can see the direction. Integrated body design, lower visual mass, simplified surfaces. But you can also see the hesitation. The car doesn't fully commit to being low and wide. It doesn't fully abandon vertical proportions. It doesn't fully embrace sculptural flow. It stops just short of each step. And that almost quality is what makes it so fascinating. From some angles, it looks ahead of its time. From others, it feels slightly unfinished. And that inconsistency creates the impression that the car is still in development, even though it was fully produced and sold. One period observer captured that feeling in a simple but revealing way. It feels like a prototype that made it to the showroom. That's not a criticism, it's a description. Because the Kaiser Special represents experimentation made public. Even the way it occupies space reinforces this idea. The cabin feels open and modern, but the body proportions remind you that the industry hadn't fully embraced the low, wide stance that would soon dominate American design. It's a halfway point, and halfway points are rarely comfortable. One owner, reflecting years later, described the experience like this: "You always feel like it's ahead of itself, but not quite there yet." That sense of being not quite there is the defining characteristic of the Kaiser Special, because it isn't trying to perfect an existing formula, it's trying to discover a new one. And discovery is rarely smooth. What makes it insane, early post-war styling that feels experimental rather than resolved. But the deeper reality is even more important. The Kaiser Special feels strange not because it failed, but because it arrived too early in the process of change. It shows the moment when designers began breaking away from the past, but before they had fully established the language of the future. A car reaching forward without a clear destination. A design exploring ideas without fully committing to them. A machine that doesn't belong to a finished era, but to the exact moment when everything was still being figured out. And that's why it feels so unusual today. Not because it's wrong, but because you can see the thinking happening inside it.
The Hudson Commodore is one of those rare cars where engineering didn't just influence the design, it completely reshaped it. This wasn't a case of styling leading and mechanics following. It was the opposite. The way the car worked determined how it looked. Built by Hudson Motor Car Company, the Commodore introduced what became known as the step-down design. And that term isn't just marketing, it's literal. Instead of sitting on top of the frame like most cars of the time, passengers stepped down into the chassis. The floor was recessed between the frame rails, lowering the center of gravity significantly. From an engineering standpoint, this was brilliant. Lower center of gravity meant better handling, better stability in corners, less body roll. In an era when most cars leaned, floated, and drifted through turns, the Hudson Commodore felt planted, confident, controlled. Drivers noticed it immediately. One owner described the experience in a way that still gets repeated today. It didn't drive like other cars, it held the road. That phrase, "step down, rides down," became part of Hudson's identity. But that engineering advantage came with a visual consequence, because lowering the cabin inside the frame didn't just change how the car drove, it changed how it had to be shaped. The doors are cut into the body differently. The side profile lacks the traditional lightness of other cars. The mass is concentrated, unified, almost architectural. It doesn't look like it was styled first. It looks like it was engineered first and styled afterward. That's where the insane quality comes in. Because most cars hide their engineering beneath styling, the Hudson reveals it. The shape is a direct consequence of the chassis. The proportions are dictated by function. The visual weight comes from structural decisions, not aesthetic ones. And that creates a car that feels fundamentally different, even if you can't immediately explain why. Driving it reinforces that difference. You sit lower, you feel more connected to the road. The car responds in a way that feels tighter, more controlled than its size suggests. It doesn't float, it grips. And that contrast between how it looks and how it behaves adds to its unique identity.
because visually it seems heavy, but dynamically it feels composed. One driver summed it up perfectly. It looks like it shouldn't corner, but it does. That contradiction is what makes the Hudson Commodore so fascinating. It challenges expectations. A heavy-looking car that handles well, an industrial shape that delivers a refined driving experience, a design that prioritizes engineering over appearance. What makes it insane? Innovative chassis design that changed how the car looked and felt. But the deeper reality is even more significant. The Commodore represents a moment when engineering briefly took control of automotive design and let the consequences show. Instead of shaping the car to fit expectations, it reshaped expectations to fit the car. And in doing so, it created something that still feels unusual today. Not because it was wrong, but because it was built around a different idea of what mattered. The Packard Custom 8 is what happens when a company refuses to abandon its identity, even as the world around it is changing too quickly to ignore. It isn't just a car, it's a continuation of a philosophy that had already begun to age. Built by Packard, the Custom 8 carried forward a design language rooted deeply in the pre-war era, a time when luxury meant presence, height, and formality. Cars weren't meant to look fast or modern, they were meant to look important. And the Packard Custom 8 does exactly that. But by the late 1940s, that definition of importance was starting to shift. At first glance, the car feels imposing. The body is tall, the roofline upright, the proportions generous in a vertical sense rather than a horizontal one. The hood stretches forward with authority, but not in a sleek or aerodynamic way. Instead, it feels structured, deliberate, almost architectural. The entire car stands rather than flows, and that distinction matters, because while competitors were beginning to experiment with lower, wider, more integrated shapes, the Packard remained committed to a more traditional silhouette. The fenders are still visually defined. The body still carries a sense of separation between its elements. The height is not disguised, it's emphasized. It doesn't try to look modern, it tries to look correct according to an older standard. That's where the tension begins. Because in isolation, the design is elegant. The lines are clean, the proportions balanced within their own logic, the details refined. There's nothing careless or awkward about it. But placed in its time, it feels delayed. One longtime owner captured that sensation perfectly. It's like driving a piece of another decade. That's not exaggeration, it's observation. Because the Packard Custom 8 doesn't just reference the past, it continues it without interruption. There's no visible transition, no attempt to reinterpret older ideas through a modern lens. It simply carries them forward as if nothing has changed. And that creates a kind of temporal dissonance. The world after World War II was moving to something new. Lower cars, wider stances, integrated bodies, a sense of motion even at rest. The industry was redefining what modern looked like. But the Packard stood still. Not physically, but philosophically. It retained height where others sought horizontality. It retained formality where others pursued fluidity. It retained structure where others embraced integration. And because of that, it began to feel massive in a different way, not just in size, but in presence. Almost ceremonial, almost rigid. From certain angles, the car doesn't look like it belongs to the late 1940s at all. It looks like it was preserved from an earlier era and placed into a new context without modification. That's what gives it its slightly surreal quality. Because it isn't outdated in the sense of being worn or obsolete. It's outdated in the sense of being unchanged. One automotive historian later described it in a way that feels almost poetic. It's not behind its time, it's outside of it. That's the key difference. The Packard Custom 8 doesn't just feel like a failed attempt at modernity. It feels like a deliberate refusal to participate in it. And that refusal creates something unusual. Because most cars evolve. This one persists. Driving it reinforces that impression. The seating position is commanding, almost formal. The experience isn't about connection to the road, it's about separation from it. You don't feel low and integrated into the machine. You feel elevated, composed, removed. It's not a driver's car in the modern sense. It's a presence. One longtime owner reflected on this difference. You don't drive it like a car, you carry yourself in it. That mindset belongs to an earlier era of luxury, where the vehicle was an extension of status rather than an expression of motion or performance. And by the late 1940s, that idea was already beginning to fade. What makes it insane? A design frozen in time while the world moved on. But the deeper reality is even striking. The Packard Custom 8 isn't just frozen, it's consistent. It represents a moment when consistency became a disadvantage, when holding on to identity meant falling out of step with change, when elegance, once timeless, suddenly became tied to a specific past. And that's why the car feels the way it does today. Not simply old, but preserved. A machine that didn't evolve with its era, and in doing so, became a perfect reflection of the one it refused to leave behind.
The Nash Ambassador Airflyte is one of the clearest examples of what happens when aerodynamic theory collides with everyday automotive design, and the result stops trying to look normal altogether. Built by Nash Kelvinator Corporation under the leadership of George Mason and influenced by aerodynamic engineer Niels Erik Wahlberg, the Airflyte wasn't designed to follow styling trends. It was designed around airflow efficiency at a time when most American cars still prioritized visual tradition over wind resistance. And that's where the problem begins. Because when you fully commit to aerodynamics without compromise, you don't just change details, you change proportions. The Nash Ambassador Airflyte ends up with a body that is unusually smooth, unusually rounded, and unusually unified. There are almost no sharp transitions. The fenders are fully integrated into the body. The surfaces float continuously from front to rear without interruption. Even the wheels seem partially absorbed into the overall shape. From a technical perspective, it makes sense. From a visual perspective, it feels unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity is what gave rise to its famous nickname, the Bathtub Nash. Because the silhouette doesn't behave like traditional automotive design. Instead of emphasizing separation, hood, cabin, trunk, it compresses everything into a single continuous volume. The roofline flows into the rear without a clear break. The sides bulge outward gently rather than defining sharp character lines. The result is a shape that feels almost inflated, as if air pressure rather than metal has formed it. Not aggressive, not angular, just rounded. One early observer described the reaction perfectly. It doesn't look designed, it looks like it was shaped. That distinction is important because most cars are understood as assemblies of parts. The Airflyte behaves more like a single object that has been molded into form. That's where its strangeness comes from. At the time of its introduction, American buyers were still adjusting to post-war design evolution. Cars were becoming lower, wider, and more integrated, but still retained recognizable structure. The Airflyte pushed beyond that comfort zone by removing nearly all visual segmentation. The effect was immediate. Some people saw innovation, others saw something almost alien. Because the brain expects cars to have edges, clear points where one section ends and another begins. The Airflyte minimizes those edges to the point where the eye struggles to separate components. Even the stance contributes to the effect. The body sits relatively high compared to later 1950s designs, but because everything is rounded and continuous, it doesn't feel tall in the traditional sense. Instead, it feels full, like volume without interruption. That fullness is what makes it controversial. One owner summarized the experience with a line that has followed the car ever since. It's either ahead of its time or from another planet. Both interpretations make sense depending on perspective.
If you focus on engineering, it's ahead of its time. The aerodynamic philosophy, reduced drag shape, and integrated bodywork anticipate ideas that would become standard much later. If you focus on aesthetics, it feels almost disconnected from conventional automotive language of its era, and that tension defines its legacy. Driving the Nash Ambassador Airflyte reinforces that sense of difference. The cabin feels unusually spacious due to the curved roof and integrated structure. Visibility is different, shaped by the rounded glass and body proportions. The experience is comfortable but visually unusual, even from inside. It doesn't behave like a car trying to look fast or aggressive. It behaves like a car trying to move through air as efficiently as possible, even at the expense of traditional form. One historian later described it in a way that captures its essence. It's what happens when wind tunnel logic becomes styling. What makes it insane is extreme aerodynamic styling that sacrificed conventional beauty. But the deeper truth is that the Nash Ambassador Airflyte represents a moment when function briefly took control of form in a way the market wasn't fully ready for. It wasn't designed to shock, it was designed to reduce drag. But in doing so, it unintentionally created one of the most visually distinctive silhouettes of its era. A car that doesn't just look different, it looks like it was shaped by a different set of rules entirely.